Hey YouTube, welcome back. One of the new unique items that we got in patch 1.1 was the big black, what's it called? Black Blade of Chaos. So the Black Blade of Chaos is a new unique two-handed sword. It's an Odachi, so it has that sweet melee critical strike multiplier. It's one of those premier bases for two-handed swords. And the best line of text on this is that it turns you into a flipping ninja. So this thing says, Lethal Mirage no longer grants invulnerability, but instead it's a much quicker attack. Now, if you just read this item, you might not know what it looks like, but of course, this was teased on one of the early videos going into 1.1, and immediately it captured everyone's imagination because it's so cool. Normally, Lethal Mirage is a skill that it has a very long cooldown, it's very incentivized to build cooldown recovery speed, and you use it once every 10 seconds or so as a huge nuke that deals an absolute ton of damage. So the Black Blade of Chaos is basically a brand new skill introduced into Bladedancer. And in fact, I don't want to say that this is the best Bladedancer build. In fact, I do not think that any variation of Black Blade of Chaos is the best, but it is my favorite. It's really fun to play. So it has shortcomings. The damage could be better. The survivability could be better. You could be playing a different build. But listen, if you haven't played with the Black Blade of Chaos, I want to recommend it to you. Whether you go bleed or crit or all in on Shadow Daggers or some kind of hybrid like we ended up playing here, it's a very fun playstyle, and it makes me want to play more Bladedancers in the future. So first things first, sick item, love it. I don't think you're realistically going to be using this two-handed sword outside of Lethal Mirage. It's not that flexible of an item, but using it for Lethal Mirage, being a Bladedancer, is a hell of a time. So give it a look. What we ended up doing this time, we investigated a handful of different playstyles with this. The very first thing that I heard lots of people talking about was the synergy with Shift. So if you have a low cooldown with Lethal Mirage, you can simply Shift, crit, Shift, crit, Shift, crit, and then you have a playstyle where you're building cooldown recovery speed for Shift because your Lethal Mirage are going to have a very low cooldown. And that is your next non-channeled attack your next non-channel attack after Shift automatically crits. And of course, that applies across the entire duration of Lethal Mirage, all of the little mirages that are there. So that's a very easy way of building it. And kind of like the level 0 build, like the very first build that comes to mind for this. It's like, well, it has lightning penetration per dexterity. You're playing a rogue, you build dexterity, you get a bunch of flat damage off it, and you convert your Lethal Mirage into lightning damage, and you go ham. So I do want to take an opportunity here to shine a light on some other people out there who've been playing builds as well. I'm going to show their builds and their videos on stream. But there's another content creator out there named Hachadino, and his was the first and also the only other Bladedancer build out there using Black Blade of Chaos. So he went all in on trying to get like as big a nuke as possible, using all of the temporary buffs, really trying to one-shot stuff. And his build looked very impressive for the investment that he put into it. So he converted Lethal Mirage into lightning damage, and he went ham on that front. So that seems like the level 0 build. That's like the build that's written on the Black Blade of Chaos. But what else can you do instead? Well, other content creators, I talked to Dread a lot. So his idea was, well, what if you took, instead of being a crit build, what if you use Shift for the other buffs that it can give to your next non-channeled skill, which is Bleed. Bleed duration, physical penetration with bleed chance, and then the more damage and the more damage stuff that come along with those nodes in Shift also. So you could play this as a bleed build, and in fact, this is the very first thing that I did. So what really impressed me about the bleed version of Black Blade of Chaos is that your weapon has no text on it. It doesn't do anything for your build. It has basically no text. It has dexterity, technically. That said, even with no text on it, it dealt a lot of damage. It was a very acceptable amount of damage. However, at some point you need to ask yourself, should I be using this weapon that has no text on it, or should I perhaps be using it for text? Because text is very strong in Last Epoch. We like having flat damage or crit multi, or something that we can actually use. So if you wanted to go bleed, maybe you want like a 2 or 3 LP Black Blade of Chaos, which is very hard to come across. But I was impressed that just having the Shift Bleed playstyle, building bleed on all of your gear, percent increased damage, all that kinds of stuff with a Validator's Chalice, that it felt fine, honestly. It just lacked scaling because your weapon does so little. The next thing that we investigated after that was like an all-in Shadow Dagger build, which is very close to where we ended up. one of the things that I liked most about the all-in Shadow Daggers is that it highlighted something new that just got introduced to the game for patch 1.1, and that is in Puncture, there's a brand new node called Death's Imprint. It's not a brand new node, but it has new text on it. It says, doubled chance on direct use, which means if you're directly punching something with a self-cast of Puncture, poke, poke, your every other hit is going to detonate those Shadow Daggers. So instead of 1, 2, 3, 4 pop, it goes 1, 2 pop, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, right? Shadow Daggers are an ailment. You need 4 stacks of them into pop, and you apply 2 of them at a time with your Puncture. And that's really, really cool. Some of the other things you get from using Puncture in your build is that you get to take nodes like in the Bladedancer skill tree, chance to get a Dust Shroud on melee attack, use, and hit. We also get Frenzy, where you can also like apply ailments like Chill or Slow if we have access to those in the build. And then we have like some armor shreds and Fizz Shred, and we can use that instead of, building Fizz Shred as a blessing, for example. So there's some benefits here. It also makes your mana just a tiny bit better. So the next thing that we did after thinking about going all in on lightning damage, which to me wasn't that interesting because it's the thing written on the sword, and I like to be, just a little bit hipster. We tried the bleed stuff and it wasn't scaling enough, and this build was a all-in Shadow Dagger build. So for all-in Shadow Dagger, what we were primarily doing is holding down right-click and also holding down Lethal Mirage. So you can see what this playstyle kind of looks like. Like maybe we have a Smoke Bomb up because that gives us some buffs as well. But this is primarily what we were doing. And it was fine, but if you're all in on Shadow Daggers, we were not taking the shift nodes because the shift nodes say damage with your next attack, and giving damage or giving crit to your next Lethal Mirage does nothing for Shadow Daggers. Shadow Daggers, for those of you who don't know, they're a little bit weird. They're not quite, bleed or ignite or one of those ailments that are applied by a skill. They do not benefit from more multipliers that are written on the skill themselves. So something like Puncture, if Puncture says, Puncture deals more damage but has less attack speed, that 12% more damage multiplier does not get inherited by Shadow Daggers. For those of you who played Spark Charges before, you know that this is actually the exact same thing. So Shadow Daggers and Spark Charges do not inherit more multipliers from the parent skill unless it's explicitly stated otherwise in something like Lightning Blast, for example, for those of you who are playing Spark Charge builds. So we spec'd out of these nodes in Shift for the guaranteed crit, and we were going all in on Shadow Daggers. We were not doing anything with Lethal Mirage damage, and the damage was like okay, but one of the things you'll realize is that like unless we're popping the Shadow Dagger, unless we have 1, 2, 3, 4 pop, our damage was very low because we didn't have a guaranteed crit. We weren't scaling weapon damage. We weren't scaling Lethal Mirage damage. We weren't doing anything else, just Shadow Daggers. So like it was fine, but it was kind of annoying. Like it wasn't quite the playstyle that we wanted, and it ended up being more melee than I would have liked as well. And we'll get back to the melee portion in a moment here. So at that point, we were poking around for more ideas, seeing what else existed out there, and someone in Twitch chat recommended a second YouTube video. So I talked about that first YouTube video that we mentioned, but the second one was someone named Ilov, and I think it's an IL, maybe it might be LL, but Ilov tried a more all-in Shadow Dagger build. So I guess it's actually a less all-in Shadow Dagger build. So instead of just being Shadow Daggers and that's your only source of damage, what they ended up doing is something that I ended up enjoying as well. So it is shift crit, which means that we are scaling more damage multipliers on Lethal Mirage, kinda, sorta. But what this means for us is that instead of our clear speed being gated on a huge SD proc, well, we don't really need, 500,000 damage or 400,000 damage to kill, tiny trash monsters. What if our primary playstyle was shift crit, and all of the Lethal Mirages would crit, all of them would hit an AoE, they clear out trash monsters very well, and then we would still be a Shadow Dagger build. We're still using double Penumbra on our rings in order to get 1 SD on hit, and then we're also taking the Shadow Cascade nodes. So I think Shadow Cascade is a really interesting inclusion here. You definitely would not be using this if you're playing like a normal Lethal Mirage build without Black Blade of Chaos. But now that we are proccing this so often, you can see that any time that we have those little like red daggers going out, that is an instance of Shadow Cascade shooting out. So Shadow Cascades are also applying some extra Shadow Dagger chance up here. It scales % increased damage, And most importantly, and to me, it also kind of fixes your mana. So if you don't have the Shadow Cascades going off, then all of a sudden you're going to be losing mana at some point, and having Puncture is a nice way of generating that mana back. But as you progress, you 500, 600, 1,000 corruption, you end up wanting to be less and less melee and more combo oriented. So you can just be on the move, you know, build a bunch of cooldown recovery speed, jump around like this, and you don't really want to be poking with Puncture because that leaves you in a more vulnerable spot, and it also means that you are taking damage when instead you could be taking less damage based on the rogue mastery here with the evasion node. So there's a couple things that went into this, and it actually means that, to me, there's 4 different Black Blade of Chaos builds. There is the all-in, like, lightning damage one, which you can either play as a one-shot version or not a one-shot version. We'll talk about that in a while. The second one would be Bleed, which I think needs a lot of help based off LP, because your weapon literally has no text on it. One would be all-in Shadow Daggers, which is where what I had been on previously, like not shift crit, basically just numb-locking Lethal Mirage for bosses. And the fourth one would be like a shift crit plus Shadow Daggers. We're not trying to be melee, we're trying to be as evasive as possible, and all of our damage is coming from some kind of play style along these lines here. So there's like 4 different builds. I think the fourth one is the coolest one. I also think it makes a really good use out of Black Blade of Chaos. So that is a lot of information for you. Before we dig into skills and the mastery and the gear and whatnot, let me tell you some downsides of the build. First of all, I think it's a little bit squishy. It's just a little bit squishy. The build that I ended up playing here, I'd like to get a little bit more life. 2,600 life is a bit low, but you'll note that my helmet has very bad suffixes on it. So we have vitality on our boots. We have tier 7% life in our on our belt here. We have hybrid tier 6 hybrid life in our gloves. But I'm still feeling kind of low on life here. I wish that I were 3,000 life. I just, I'd like to have just a tiny bit more. So I'm feeling the strain for trying to get those affixes on my gear while also getting the right damage affixes to make sure that I can kill monsters quickly. Because with a playstyle like this, you really want to kill all the trash with one shift click, and you want to blow up, bosses pretty quickly thereafter. So that's one thought. It's like we're kind of squishy here. We're squishier than I wish we were. I feel like I like this build so much despite the squishiness, but the damage output feels great. So it's a very fun playstyle to play. In terms of defense, the other person that I talked about a moment ago, Ilaf, I'll show their build planner on screen for just a moment here. We're going to talk about that a little bit more later. But they ended up going for like more of a ward defense. So they had Wall of Nothing, whereas I had Titan Heart. And they went for Somnia, which is kind of cute. So it has, what do you call it? It has ward retention on it. So why not just use an item that has ward retention? And then they juiced up their defense using a Ravenous Void as well. So I can tell that they were really thinking about their defenses in this build with the inclusion of something like Ravenous Void instead of something like Laraka's. So Laraka's gives you up to 130% throwing crit multi, but for the astute among you, you will realize that Shadow Daggers are not only melee, but they're melee and throwing attack. So because they have the throwing attack tag, it means that this crit multi does apply to our Shadow Daggers applied by this build. A quick note before we jump into everything else is you're going to notice that we get a fuck ton of crit multi in this build, especially because we're using a Black Blade of Chaos. So normally if you're playing something like this, you'd be using a Fulgurite shard, like a one-handed dagger instead, and you wouldn't have this, 170, or for mine, 140 melee crit multi here. And we have so much crit multi, especially coming in from nodes like up here, plus 75 crit multi on this. So crit multi actually scales our damage a lot less than you would think it would, because like we have crit multi on both of our rings, we have crit multi on this that we wouldn't normally have because we'd be using different weapons. And Laraka's is not as OP as you think it is. Even our amulet, we ended up going with percent increased physical damage as our exalted attribute here. Going for something like tier 7 crit multi, even on a Nihilus. It's not nearly as good as you think it is because we have so much crit multi otherwise. Last thing before we jump into it here, like the full breakdown of everything, will be I want you to note that percent physical penetration with Shadow Daggers does not show up on the tooltip for Shadow Daggers. So click on Puncture, hover over this node, hold down Alt, you'll see that it's 85. If I take off my helmet, for example, my damage goes down to 82. And that 82 is the lack of percent increased physical damage and the percent increased throwing physical damage that's sealed on my helmet. It does not account for the 87% penetration that I have there. So when you're comparing gear, just note that penetration with Shadow Daggers doesn't get counted. It applies. Don't worry, it applies, but it doesn't get counted in your tooltip. Something like generic percent increased physical penetration, like the second affix on my amulet here, does get counted in the tooltip. It's annoying. Fix your tooltip, CHG, but just so you know what's going on, that's that. The build's cool. Let's jump into it. Let's see what is going on here. I mentioned that there's like a combo play style. I said that you can go all in combo, or you can like a numlock, just cast it as often as possible. Let's talk briefly about the difference between those two things. If you wanted to go all in combo, you would want to generate as many shadows as possible, and then you'd also want to put 8 points into coated blades. So why shadows? Why coated blades? That's an excellent question. This node down here in Lethal Mirage is absolutely fucked. It's so strong. So it says it deals more damage per shadow consumed, and you put 4 points in this. It's 40% more damage per shadow consumed. That's 5 shadows. So that's 200% more damage off this. And then the node that leads up to that, Shadow Eater, this is Lethal Mirage consumes all active shadows, gaining additional mirages. So if you have 5 shadows, instead of having 6 and 7, 8, and 9, 10, which is your default because you're taking those nodes all the time, instead of having 10, you have 15 hits. And then per shadow consumed, all of those are getting big multipliers. This is an astronomical amount of damage wrapped up in these 2 nodes down here. So if you're playing Shadow Daggers, they don't scale off of the more multipliers from the skill itself. But if you're playing something like Bleed, or if you're playing something like the all-in lightning damage version, taking the lightning conversion thing up here, then these 2 nodes are absolutely insane for you. So this is one thing that you could do, and of course you'd be expecting sync strike, and you'd sync shift Lethal Mirage, and then you just like generate a bunch of mana, sync shift Lethal Mirage, sync shift Lethal Mirage, and that'd be absolutely insane damage. But you would need a lot of mana generation if you wanted to go all in to make that damage as big as possible. Because of course, if you want to one-shot stuff, you might as well take the 80% more damage, which has the penalty of plus 40 mana consumed. So this is not only 40 mana because you'd be using Sync Strike as well. So this would be 80 mana across your entire combo. So maybe you puncture to get your mana back, but you'd have to figure out how you wanted to solve that situation. If you wanted to take a page out of that other content creator's book, this person's name was Hachadino. Hachadino, I'll link his video in the description, even went further than that on his Julra star dial that triples the affixes on it for 4 seconds, every 12 seconds. He really went all in on trying to get the biggest one-shot possible. And Julra's is a great way of trying to one-shot stuff. So tier 7 dexterity here, tier 7 dexterity here. And of course that gets tripled when he uses a movement skill, when he uses a shift, and then his Lethal Mirage is juiced up to the moon. So that's absolutely insane. It's plus 60 dexterity, which is of course plus 60 or so penetration off of his weapon as well. So that's really cool technology if you really want to, sink your teeth in and have the biggest one shot possible. So that's the Lethal Mirage combo specific playstyle that you could do. For Bleed, you're probably interested in something like that as well. For our SD stuff, we're definitely interested in Gloomy End up here on the top right. This also helps to make our mana nice. Depending on whether you're Bleed build or not, you might be interested in taking this without a trace node. If you're Bleed, don't take this. If you do, I don't know what to tell you. But if you're not Bleed, of course, you can be taking these nodes as well. So we have a couple points. We're at 20 plus 3 because we have plus 3 on our relic here. You might be using a Nihilist. You might have like plus 6 or plus 4, whatever. But, for all your extra skill points, there's a couple things you could do. And the interesting part is twofold. One, you can go all the way to the bottom right here. This is a little puff of smoke that applies a little bit of frailty. It blinds enemies. And then while you're standing in it, you have critical strike avoidance as well. You can tell these nodes are outdated. They should be updated because blind and crit avoidance are actually synonymous these days. But if you wanted to spec down here in order to take care of your crit reduction or your crit avoidance, this is something that you could include in your build. And this is something that we chose to do as well. The alternative is also very spicy. You could take a handful of points and spec up here to the top left. Normally, without Black Blade of Chaos, I think these nodes are a bit of a bait because you can't possibly maintain these buffs long enough for them to be relevant and have enough cooldown to make the whole thing worthwhile. But whether you're bleed or whether you're not bleed, you could still spec into this, because with 4 points and you play a shift crit playstyle, meaning that everything crits, you have all these things stacking up to 6 seconds, and then of course you're going to be using Lethal Mirage on cooldown. You gain 800 flat dodge rating off of this, which is an astronomical amount of flat dodge. The issue with dodge builds is that you never get enough flat dodge unless you have some kind of skill like this that gives you 800 flat dodge. So if you're interested in that, you can easily cap your dodge rating with like either a dodge percent blessing or more realistically a dodge percent roll somewhere on your gear. So you could even combine that with something like the stealth pair of boots if you wanted to go ham on it, but that's your life, not mine. So let's keep going through to the next skill here. Let's talk about shift, because it's so important whether you're playing a shift crit playstyle or you're using it to juice up bleeds, or you're just using it to get next clear speed on the Shadow Dagger version of the build that we had here. What's interesting is like if you didn't want to go Shadow Cascade, you could spec into your shurikens instead. I think just having having Shadow Cascade and specking into the shift crit is the better thing to be doing, but we did try other versions of this build specking shurikens instead. There's a good conversation to have between this node on the very bottom right, Dancing Shadows. So after you shift, you use Shadow Cascade. So the difference for whether you want to have this node or not is, sorry, where is it? This one, shift, right, this. Do you want your shift to consume your shadows and cause a bunch of Shadow Cascades to go off in a circle around you, which would help your clear speed just a tiny bit? Or would you rather those shadows be preserved so that after you shift, they're still there, so that you can consume them with your Lethal Mirage instead, which would give you better single target damage? So I don't know which one's better. I think like one's gonna be better for clear speed, and the other one's gonna be better for single target. I ended up not taking the this Dancing Shadows node here, but definitely 1 point here because I want to be generating as many shadows as possible. So this last point up here, Unseen Strike, doesn't really do anything, but I was playing around with the idea of using it to help proc Veil of Night to generate more Dust Shrouds. But this top node in the middle is just flexible. You can put that somewhere else if you'd like to. Normally, my way that I would use Smoke Bomb is to stand in it and get extra Dust Shrouds. If you wanted some more defense, this is a better way of generating some Dust Shrouds if you get Glancing Blow chance. But for us, we're using it for our Silver Shrouds. Every single build should be doing this. We got some cleanse in here as well. We have our bleed chance stuff down here. And because we aren't using Sync Strike for our shadow generation, we are using Smoke Bomb for some shadow generation as well. So 4 points into this, and then 5 points into Smoke Blades. Your highest damage would be to put this down and also stand in it. And then like generate some stuff. Do that. We can shift again when it's off cooldown. And that's kind of what the damage is looking like there. If you wanted to go less all in, you could change this out, go Dust Shroud frequency instead, kind of use it for whatever your playstyle would be. Puncture is a differentiator between like my build and other people's builds. I think that using this to generate some extra Shadow Dagger chance, or to apply some ailments here, or just to generate some mana, I think it's a really nice playstyle to have, and it feels good, just like, you know, not have to necessarily wait for a cooldown. If there's one monster following you, you just like kind of poke it. So this also lines up well with the Bladedancer node for Dust Shroud chance when you use a melee attack and hit an enemy. So I like having a tiny bit of extra defense coming in from a node like this. Last up is Shadow Cascade. We're basically using this because of the Shadow Dagger chance at the very top right, but it fixes mana, which is nice, and every once in a while we're going to be able to proc this while clearing, and this is plus 140% increased physical damage, which is a good chunk of damage. So while we were building our particular character, we realized that we really were looking for percent increased damage, which is why begrudgingly we farmed these things up, tried to get them with 1 LP, and we even got one with 2 LP as well. So trying to get that percent increased physical damage, this, for those of you taking notes, was definitely the most tedious part of the build. It's a really fun playstyle, and I like the build, but man, it's kind of a pain in the ass to actually farm these rings. These rings took, not these particular rings, but to get a Penumbra ring to drop it all, it took about an hour a piece. So maybe it's a Merchant's Guild build, or maybe you just have to be luckier than I am. So yeah, we're just like looking for some physical damage, which is why it's nice to get some extra stuff in the Shadow Flourish node here, calling out the lack of percent increased physical damage, unless you're explicitly building it like this. So those are the skills. Let's take a look at the mastery real quick. You could go all in on coated blades if you want like the big Gazunga combo rogue playstyle. We're opting not to do that because, of course, this only applies to skills, and we are primarily a Shadow Dagger build, and Shadow Daggers don't benefit from more multipliers to apply to skills. So, base skill tree, very easy. Falconer, we have some more damage with haste, some extra flat life over here, and the Bladedancer skill tree. So, take a look at it. To me, everything looks super obvious, but we'll talk about it for just a moment. Remember, our Shadow Daggers do benefit from both throwing attack damage and melee attack damage. So this node is 60% increased damage. This node, likewise, is plus 32 flat damage. So, yeah, flat throwing, flat melee, that's great. This node is new. The threshold is new as of 1.1, so 50% more damage to rares and bosses. I wish Paladin had things like this, but what can you do? And I put some extra points into this Crimson Shroud generation in the middle here because having access to 3 stacks of Crimson Shrouds means that you have the full 15% less damage over time taken, and mitigating damage over time seems like a good thing to have. So again, the inclusion of Puncture allows us to try to generate these stacks much more often. We are a melee build. Shadow Daggers have the melee tag, so this helps us leech. We put 1 point in Argent Veil to have that Silver Shroud for a guaranteed dodge, which is great. 5 points in All In for crit multi, because remember, Shadow Daggers always crit, so we always benefit from the crit multi here. And then we have some extra flexible nodes for some extra armor shred chance, because I don't really have armor shred chance elsewhere in the build. We've got a little bit on the amulet here, but always having more is nice, and I felt like I had the points to flex. We didn't have frailty for a while, so 16% frailty here, and then I have a sealed tier 2, but I think if you only had like 5 points in Spellbreaker, this would be fine as well. Just get some extra frailty in your build. It'll make you feel nice and tanky. Tankier. Not tanky enough, but tankier. We also have all these points up here. Depending on how much of a one-shot you want to generate, you can put all 5 points into Essavant's Pact, or maybe even all 5 points into Exuberance. This is 10% increased damage per point. This is 15% increased damage per point. But yeah, so I think just having the 5 and 5 for perfection and confidence is quite a nice place to be, both for offense and for defense. But if you want to one-shot stuff, spec more points in here, and you can change that out as you want. The last thing that I want to call out for mastery is the marksman skill tree. I think this is kind of interesting, and I overlooked this at the beginning of playing the character, but I was poking around, and I saw some other people including this in their build as well, and I think it's very interesting. You could go 0 points in marksman, which is a great option for me, or you can go maybe 13 points in marksman, and this would be a great time to get some extra more damage multipliers and try to one-shot stuff, like if you're one-shotting Aberoth or Tier 4 Jeweler or something, because having 16% more damage is nothing to joke about. This used to be percent increased damage. It got changed to more damage in this 1.1 patch, and get dexterity down here and then 8 points there. That's 16% more, and it's quite good. However, I think it's even more interesting than that. You could just continue to spec into this. These other nodes over here, cooldown, concentration, 40 flat dodge rating for points, a lot of dodge, and then this is increased dodge rating, increased movement speed, and even less damage taken while you have concentration up for a nice dodgy playstyle. Remember that one of the variations of Lethal Mirage was taking these nodes in the top left for 800 flat dodge, which kind of works well when you spec fully into this and you're getting all this increased dodge rating as well. So less damage taken, increased dodge rating, increased movement speed, flat dodge. This is a nice inclusion, and I'm surprised. I'm not used to having things in the marksman skill tree that look appealing, but here we are. So this could be something that you want to include in your Falconer or your Bladedancer builds as well, because it is a nice place to put those points. Let's take a look at our gear next. I think the gear, for the most part, is like just trying to eke out as much survivability as you can. But we're looking for a couple key pieces of percent increased damage as well. So I would say that my build, I wish that I had more cooldown recovery speed. I had these amazingly rare 2 LP Stymied Fate that have movement speed and vitality, and they're good, technically. I really wish I would have gotten the tier 7 cooldown recovery speed on these boosts instead. If I had a 1 LP with tier 7 cooldown recovery speed, I would be using that instead. So do with that information what you will. Another consideration is Shattered Chains. Shattered Chains, along with Stymied Fate to apply Doom to enemy, has upwards of 20% more melee damage. So 5 times 4, it's 20% more damage. It also has some percent increased damage on it, percent increased armor. It's an excellent belt, but it's hard to get with 2 LP on it. So you could take this off and you could instead just use a normal belt. You could use a belt with, life, hybrid, or health, hybrid health, percent health. I really would encourage getting the tier 7 cooldown recovery speed, because having that on the belt and also having that on the boots, I think that's honestly worthwhile of not having the 20% more damage from the shadow chains here. Of course, if you could just have the best of both worlds, I would feel okay not having cleanse on my character. You already have some cleanse off of smoke bomb here. I wish I had cleanse on my belts, sure, but if I had a 2 LP shadow chains with some kind of health and then tier 7 cooldown recovery speed, I would call that absolutely insane for this build. So cooldown is definitely something that you're in the market for. Plus levels for Lethal Mirage and the Relic, you're interested in that as well. Remember, crit multi is not as important as you think it is, because we have so much of it, and because of the implicit of the Black Blade of Chaos. So things like percent increased damage, and then affixes like physical penetration with Shadow Daggers are very, very important for us. On our body armor, whether you end up going a ward route with something like Wall of Nothing, or you want to go a life-based route like me with Titan Heart, you'd really like to have tier 6 or tier 7 plus mirages created by Lethal Mirage. So there's 2 Lethal Mirage affixes. One is the plus levels in the Relic, and the other one is up here. The mana efficiency makes it feel nice and good, especially for having Shadow Cascade help to recover your mana as you are using these things. You see my mana goes up just a tiny little bit. I guess it didn't right there, but just a tiny little bit off these nodes down here, right? Having plus 2 Lethal Mirages, we said that we had 6 by default, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then if we have no shadows, it goes up to 12, and then we always have shift, so that'd be 13, and then smoke bomb might be 14 or 15, depending on how quickly we are resetting our cooldown there. So it's a great affix. You should be including it in your build. If you want to go YOLO DPS, just go double prefixes with Shadow Dagger penetration stuff. We said that crit multi was not that important. I think you do want some kind of crit multi, like maybe crit multi on your relic, crit multi on your amulet, crit multi on your gloves with like Laraka's Claw. But if you gave up the glove slot and instead got crit multi on your amulet, like percent increased physical damage crit multi as your 2 implicits, or as your 2 prefixes there, then you could do what we saw that other content creator do and just opt out of using Laraka's Claws for percent increased damage, or sorry, for percent throwing crit multi, and just use Ravenous Void instead. Let me demonstrate to you why that might be an option for you. So I have 128% increased damage here, but instead I'm going to put on a Nihilus, and this Nihilus has basically no text, but it's got tier 7 crit multi. Taking a look at this node here, it says 74k as a tooltip. If I take off my Larakas, which have 92 crit multi on them, we go to 66. What was I at before? 66, 74. Then if I take this off, we're at 67. And like, you really don't gain that much from using, 130 crit multi here. So I think if you could end up using something like, let's see, I'll like take this one off. This is 70. So remember, like 66, 67 with no gloves at all, just having percent increased damage here and like that extra physical penetration. Like, get Fizz Pen, get crit multi, and I think you just like give up the Laraka's Claw and use something more defensive like a Ravenous Void, or honestly, just like a pair of normal Eternal Gauntlets that have a big armor value as the implicit instead of the 75 armor that Laraka's Claws have here. So that's a bit of rambling about the gear, but I think those are the important points there, especially the stuff that we were talking about. So hopefully you have more than tier 1 lightning res as a suffix on your helmet, but I'm a very unlucky person, so this is the best helmet that I could come up with, unfortunately. For your idols, you're going to do one of 2 things. You either Fizz Pen with Shadow Daggers if you want YOLO DPS, or if you're feeling a little bit squishier, you could opt into your either hybrid health idols or into like health plus res, health plus res, health plus res. I had a hard time getting enough res on this character, so we're not a paladin, we're not a sentinel, we don't have a bunch of res nodes on our character. We have less damage taken all over the place. We have lots and lots of damage, but we don't have the easiest time gearing up our defenses. So one of the benefits of using something like Annihilus is that you have plus to all resistances as one of those affixes there. Hopefully yours roll as well. But for us, you see, we're just kind of scraping by with our resistances. Nothing too special there. And then we have the plus 20 all res from our blessing, trying to help round that out. But as your gear gets better and better, as you can like squish all of your resistances into one item, then you can instead get your hybrid health idols to get that HP value just a tiny bit higher there. So that's what we're doing with our idols. I don't have like a recommendation of like exactly what to do. I feel like maybe like 2 or maybe 4 of these, and then like 3 flat health idols could be a good combination of those. Something along those lines. Speaking of blessings, we'll flip over to this real quick. Remember, we already have a ton of crit multi, so just using this for something like Void Res instead, it's a very good use of your affixes. We have Lightning Res from this. You could go Stun Chance or something, but Lightning Res is nice. Just fix your resistances. And then plus 20 all res. You could continue fixing resistances with something like percent increased Fizz res, but we went for the classic of flat armor and percent increased armor. So we're not using shift shurikens, which mean we're not getting the, what is it, 150% increased armor off of the bladed armor node. And we're not getting, you know, the fizz shred that comes along with using shurikens. So we're just a little bit squishier not having this in our build. And we're like a little bit more on the DPS side. We could trim some DPS and do this instead. But I think that Shadow Cascade and Puncture have their place in this build. But you could trim one of those and go for shurikens instead. But I guess, can you really get up here? You need 7 points for this. 1, 2, 5. It'd be hard to get both Sleight of Hand and the Shift Crit. And I think the Shift Crit's more important. Maybe you just don't take the invulnerability. I wouldn't do that. Maybe you can do that. So that is a rundown of skills, masteries, gear, blessings, and idols for this character. The thing that I said at the very beginning of this video is that Black Blade of Chaos is way more fun than I thought it was going to be. I don't have that much of an interest in playing Bladedancer builds. It feels like the skills have been the same forever. So for me, Rogue has been kind of boring for a while, and Black Blade of Chaos has been a lot more fun than I thought it was going to be. It's just really enjoyable. I feel like I clear monos after I'm finished with them much more often on this character than I have on other characters. It's kind of squishy, but it's fun. The damage could be better. It's really fun. I just want to keep playing it. It's a fun play style to have here. So I'm going to show both these videos real quickly on stream. And of course, these will be both linked in the description here. But this is Hachadino. We mentioned them previously. They were the only other initial piece of investigation that I could find. I like looking at what other content creators are doing. But this is the all-in Gazunga lightning damage one-shot build where they were just trying to one-shot stuff as quickly as possible. So that's kind of cool. For their build planner here, they did Umbral as well. I think both these people did Umbral Blades, which kind of surprises me. Umbral Blades doesn't really add much to either of these builds. They just kind of put it in there because there's nothing else to be putting in there. I guess you can look at their build for inspiration as well. Like maybe this person should have gone like Shadow Cascade. Maybe this person should have gone Puncture instead. But there's just a tiny bit of flexibility in what that last skill is. And Umbral Blades is a skill that deals damage, so maybe you too want to include it. I think the best argument in favor of Umbral Blades is honestly the fact that it has chill chance on it, and you're using a unique weapon and you don't have access to chill chance otherwise. So if chill is like a make or break for you, then it's a nice thing to have. It's also automated and not melee range, so Umbral Blades might be something that fits your playstyle better. So that's what their build looked like. You can poke around it yourself. This other build from Illuff, they were doing a Black Blade of Chaos hybrid Shadow Dagger plus the shift crit thing. And I like what their build looked like a lot. Looks like they were farming pretty comfortably at 1,000 corruption. So I'm glad that their build worked out so well for them. So we'll link their build, and you can go take a look at the intricacies of their stuff as well. Maybe I should put this at the very beginning of the video, but I've kind of been calling this build like flickerless Flicker Strike because it does feel like Flicker Strike. It's just you aren't the one flickering. If you've been doing other things with Black Blade of Chaos instead, let me know what your builds look like. If you solved any of the problems that I had, or even if you had one that felt nice and tanky, or, I don't know, anything. It's a cool sword. If you're doing anything with this thing that isn't Lethal Mirage, very interested in that as well. In any case, thanks for being here. I'll see you next time.